Okay, good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to have you all with us um, and to be chairing this evening's session. Um, you may recognise Andrew Porwancher because we had him speak for Jewish Renaissance a little while ago when he was talking about Alexander Hamilton and his book about Hamilton in relationship to the Jewish community. Well, Hamilton's Jewish World kind of gave us that little taste for American history and American politics. So I'm really delighted that we've kept on the relationship with Andrew. You might have seen a couple of issues ago or feature on his newest book called American Maccabee, which he's going to be talking about tonight. And in fact, I had the pleasure of chairing him and interviewing him in person at Jewish Book Week this year. And that was a sold out event. So we thought, why not have another conversation? We enjoyed talking so much, but we thought, let's try another conversation. This time, open it up online so that people who weren't in London can come. And I'm really delighted to say that we're actually doing this on publication day. So the book that we're about to talk about in the US is being published today. So if anyone is interested, you'll be able to get it via American sites. The British publication isn't for a couple of months, but if you do want to wait for that, and I will remind everybody again at the end, if you booked and you did book for this session, in the thank you email, the receipt email that's going out tomorrow, with the video of Andrew's talk, you'll get a 30% discount code. So if you want to wait for the British publication, you'll get a little reduction on that. But I'm really glad that on the International Publication Day, the first publication day, we at Jewish Renaissance are hosting Professor Porwancher. So let me do a little bit of a formal introduction and then I'm going to pass over to him. He will talk for about 45 to 50 minutes. We will then have a little bit of a conversation ourselves and then open up to questions for all of you. So we're very, very much looking forward to him speaking. Um, Andrew is a native of Princeton. He earned degrees from Brown and Northwestern before crossing the Atlantic and completing his PhD in history at Cambridge, as well as a postdoc in Oxford. Currently, he serves as Professor of Constitutional History at Arizona State University. And I'm really delighted to say that Arizona State is one of the most recent institutional subscribers to Jewish Renaissance. So we're really building a relationship. Andrew's books include The Devil Himself, which was published by Oxford University Press, and it was adapted for the stage at Dublin's historic Smoke Alley Theatre. And of course, as you all know, The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, which was a Princeton University Press publication. And not only did we love Hamilton, the Hamilton book, but a lot of more people did. It won prizes, including the Journal of American Revolution Book of the Year award. I'm really delighted, though, that tonight we'll be discussing his fifth book. So that's called American Maccabee. It explores the fascinating and, as you're going to hear, quite complicated relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and the Jewish community. Um, it's, I mean, I've had the privilege now to read it, and actually, I dipped into it again this week, but I got to read an advance copy in the spring. And I would say for me, one of the most interesting thing about it are those complexities, that Roosevelt himself is a complex character. His relationship with the community is complicated, and Andrew teases out all the different dimensions. But also, as he wrote about for Jewish Renaissance, there are so many echoes between that period of history and issues America and the world is wrestling with today. So I'm really looking forward to opening up some of those questions for us in the chat afterwards as well. But for now, I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to welcome Andrew onto the screen in my place and hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really want to thank Aviva. It's always great to see her, and it is always an honor to get to work with Jewish Renaissance. She even said I can pronounce it the American way, Renaissance, to make it a little easier for me. And I want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your evening. It's still in the morning here in Arizona, where it is, I think, if I put it in Celsius, around 37 degrees. Um, but I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me, especially on the day that the book came out here in the United States, and in a couple months over on your side of the pond. So, with that, let us turn to the story of Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. I wish I had a little Jew in me, Roosevelt once mused to a friend. Mere wishing would indeed mark the limits of Roosevelt's claim to Jewish ancestry, not a drop of Jewish blood coursed through his veins. If anything, Roosevelt was the ultimate insider of the Protestant elite that dominated American life in his era. His father descended from a New York political dynasty whose eminence in Manhattan dated back to the days of Dutch colonial rule in the 1600s. His mother was a Southern belle of such renown that many believed her to be the inspiration for the character of Scarlett O'Hara in the classic Southern novel Gone with the Wind. Theodore lived a life consistent with his patrician upbringing. He enrolled at Harvard, he served as a military officer, and he ultimately seized the grandest prize of all, the Oval Office. This silver spoon statesman, who had grown up in the fashionable neighborhood of Gramercy Park in New York, had little in common with the Yiddish speaking immigrants moistening their brows in the sweatshops of the Lower East Side just a short walk away. Roosevelt's privileged path was even further removed from the dreadful subsistence of Jews still struggling to survive in Eastern Europe. And yet, for all the differences between Roosevelt and embattled Jews on both sides of the Atlantic, their causes became pivotal to his presidency. He would help shape their lives, and they in turn would help shape his legacy. The story of Roosevelt and the Jews begins not at the White House, nor in the shtetls of Russia, but in the epicenter of American Jewish life, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. One contemporary writer in the 1890s described the Lower East Side as home to, quote, a Jewry that had burst all bounds. 6 days a week, commerce was the lifeblood of what the locals simply referred to as the East Side. Every Friday, East Siders would shop at the ironically nicknamed Pig Market, where everything but pork was for sale. Vendors and buyers haggled loudly over all imaginable goods: spectacles and suspenders, cups and candlesticks, pants and pickles. Two short blocks from the Pig Market was Allen Street, home to a notorious red light district. Jewish prostitutes would place lamps in their windows to signal their trade. One renowned prostitute always took leave from work on the high holy days, explaining to a journalist matter of factly, I go to shul. On nearby Forsyth Street, Synagogue Beth Israel shared a wall with a brothel. Praying congregants competed with paying customers for vocal supremacy. It was hardly atypical to find such sanctity and such sin commingling in turn of the century New York. Forsyth Street ran into Houston Street, home to a legendary delicatessen that is still open today. Perhaps some of you visiting New York have been there, known as Katz's. It's a favorite haunt at the time of actors in the Yiddish theaters. And those theaters would often stage Shakespearean classics, but with a Jewish twist. Lower East Side audiences were probably unaware that the original version of Hamlet did not involve a subplot where the titular character trains to become a rabbi. Roaring above Allen Street was the elevated train. The pandemonium that prevailed in the train cars was every bit as frenetic as life below. One Midwesterner visiting New York recalled, a second's inattention, a moment's respite from the dangling leather which hangs from the roof, and you are shot into somebody's back, bosom, or belly. The elevated train offered a grisly view into the dark heart of the Lower East Side, the tenements. At all hours, passengers could glimpse into these open windows of the brick buildings, usually 5 to 8 stories tall, crammed with impoverished Jewish families. The tenements often doubled as sweatshops. When we think about sweatshops, we haven't imagined a large factory, and there were some Jews at that time who labored in that kind of setting, but most of them were hunched over sewing machines in the cramped confines of tenement apartments. The Danish American reformer Jacob Riis thought that these buildings seemed to embody the muted despair of their inhabitants, writing, "The thousands of lighted windows in the tenements glow like dull red eyes." But life was not all bleak on the Lower East Side. Thanks to free public schooling and a Jewish premium on education, Jewish families enjoyed a remarkable degree of upward mobility, with the children of immigrants achieving a degree of success that their parents had rarely imagined for themselves. Newcomers to the Lower East Side found that the shtetl's strictures gave way to that most quintessential American value, choice. Some Jewish immigrants flocked to socialism with its skepticism of religion. Others fell in with the anarchists who flouted Yom Kippur by hosting dances that day. Individual Jews were free to engage with their heritage on their own terms, if at all. And for most East Side Jews, that meant sustaining the ancient faith of their ancestors. Here, then, was America's largest Jewish neighborhood, old world tradition and new world temptation, grinding poverty and novel opportunity, communal belonging and individual freedom, Yiddish and English, piety and vice, all condensed into a couple square miles of teeming humanity. Slum life on the East Side may have been rife with hazard, but it was also rich with hope. No quota limited the number of Jews who could join a given profession. No edict precluded a Jewish child from attending school. No pogrom ransacked Jewish businesses or shed Jewish blood. Rather than relegated to second-class citizenship, an impoverished Jew could cast a ballot that tallied just the same as the wealthiest Gentiles. But the Lower East Side was not only the starting point for so many Jews grasping at the American dream. Amid that neighborhood's swarming streets, in the summer of 1895, a young police commissioner began chasing a dream of his own. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. And at just 36 years old, he was part of a reform movement that was then sweeping New York and the nation at large to clean up corruption and graft in public life. Roosevelt was renowned for his boundless energy, and he was hardly content to remain behind his desk at police headquarters. He took to the streets, block by block. He barnstormed the Lower East Side as Jewish audiences squeezed into various venues to hear him speak. His barrel-chested build gestured toward his physicality, his thick spectacles towards his intellectuality, his dapper attire toward his gentility. He excitedly wrote his friend, the U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, quote, "The crowded East Side audiences of Second Avenue and Avenue A greet me with an enthusiasm I never anticipated. Of course, there is much hostility shown too." And I'll mention as an aside that this was traditionally Democratic turf and he was a Republican. But Roosevelt continued, "But the wonder is that I should have so strong a following among them. I have spoken again and again in packed halls on the East Side during the summer with temperature at boiling point, both as regards the weather and the audience. Generally, I have been interrupted, and frequently some speakers jumped up and at my request very often has taken the platform to speak against me. But I have never failed to carry the house with me at the end." Roosevelt took pains to recruit Jewish officers for the police force. Partly it was a matter of principle. He thought that the police should reflect the city's diversity. But it was also a matter of practicality as well. TR needed Yiddish-speaking officers who understood Jewish residents literally and culturally. For New York's Jewish newcomers, the sight of a fellow Jew sporting a policeman's uniform was a stirring symbol of American possibility. Policemen back in Russia enforced discriminatory laws against Jews. And during the outbreak of pogroms, they had passively watched as mobs mercilessly beat Jewish victims. But in America, Jews could become commanding figures, defenders of the people and of the people's law. Of all the Jews who joined Roosevelt's force, one stands out among the rest: Otto Raphael. The Raphael family had emigrated from Russia and opened a struggling meat market on Allen Street, where Otto helped out. Otto Raphael was roused one evening in 1895 by the scent of smoke when a nearby tenement became engulfed in flames. He knew how dangerous the tenements could be, even under the best of conditions. His own mother had tragically slipped and died when she fell into a cellar apartment accidentally a few years earlier. Now, on the fateful night of the fire, Raphael, who was in his mid 20s and full of vigor, ran into the burning building to rescue people trapped inside. Later that year, Teddy Roosevelt, also known as TR, was giving a talk at a YMCA downtown, and Raphael was in attendance. The philanthropist who had invited TR to speak insisted that he meet this local neighborhood hero who had saved numerous lives from an inferno. Roosevelt sized him up and encouraged him to apply for the police force. And Raphael did. Out of 380 applicants, he ranked 10th in mental ability and first in physical ability. Naturally, he earned a spot on the force. And as it turned out, Roosevelt's newest Jewish officer had a skill set of keen interest to him. This Jewish policeman had some amateur boxing titles to his name and became TR's sparring partner. Their friendship, cultivated in the ring, would last a lifetime. Roosevelt came to know Raphael's entire family, and Raphael would later visit TR at the White House when Roosevelt became president. As a reform-minded police commissioner, Roosevelt found common cause with other reformers who were seeking to ameliorate dire conditions on the Lower East Side. Many of these reformers were naturally Jewish. Roosevelt came to befriend Lillian Wald, the 28-year-old founder of the Henry Street Settlement on the East Side. She was the daughter of an affluent German Jewish family in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she opted out of her life of privilege to take up nursing in New York. At Wald's behest, Roosevelt became an honorary inductee to her settlement house's American Hero Club, which was dedicated to the study of great figures from U.S. history. TR must have been the only mustachioed member of the group because the other participants were local boys no older than 12. Roosevelt's foray into the Lower East Side gave him his first sustained exposure to what were called downtown Jews, as opposed to the uptown Jews with whom he had previously fraternized. Uptown Jews luxuriated in expensive brownstones on fashionable streets. Downtown Jews crowded into East Side tenements. Uptown Jews originated from Central Europe, often Germany. Downtown Jews hailed from Eastern Europe, typically Russia. Uptown Jews practiced Reform Judaism. Downtown Jews gravitated toward Orthodoxy. Uptown Jews had migrated to America in the middle decades of the 19th century. Downtown Jews were fresh arrivals. Uptown Jews were Americanized. Downtown Jews were still learning the ways of their adopted homeland. Uptown Jews met with success in banking and law. Downtown Jews subsisted in sweatshops and hawked goods from pushcarts. Roosevelt's entree into the world of downtown Jews was sufficiently well received that he became a distinguished guest at Jewish weddings on the East Side, often honored with the duty of escorting the bride or her mother to the banquet following the ceremony. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had a conspicuous confrontation with anti-Semitism during Hanukkah in his first year as police commissioner. A vicious Jew hater from Germany, Hermann Alvart, was planning a trip to New York City to spread his invidious message. Alvart was almost cartoonishly villainous. Back in the 1880s, he had been sacked as a school headmaster after the revelation that he had stolen funds designated for the children's Christmas party. Now, in the 1890s, Alvart set his sights on an American speaking tour, including, provocatively, a planned lecture on the Lower East Side. Anxious Jews approached Commissioner Roosevelt. They asked him to bar Alvart from speaking, or at least to deny him police protection. But Roosevelt could not grant their request without violating the principle of free speech. And even absent that constitutional right, he believed that government censorship would only serve to make Alvart a martyr. TR would later recall that he felt at the time, quote, the proper thing to do was to make him ridiculous. To that end, Roosevelt devised an exceedingly clever scheme. He would provide Albert a police detail comprised entirely of Jewish officers. Now, Roosevelt leaned on a deputy of his to round up Jewish policemen and to bring them to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt tells this deputy, don't bother yourself to hunt up their religious antecedents. Take those who have the most pronounced Hebrew physiognomy. The stronger their ancestral marking, the better. The group of 30 to 40 Jewish policemen was brought to Roosevelt, and he launched into a speech informing them of a vital duty that lay ahead. Roosevelt said, quote, now I am going to assign you men to the most honorable service you have ever done, the protection of an enemy and the defense of religious liberty and free speech in the chief city of the United States. You all know who and what Dr. Alvart is. It should be your pride to see that he is protected. That will be the finest way of showing your appreciation of the liberty you yourselves enjoy under the American flag. This was merely the first encounter that Roosevelt would have with European anti-Semitism. Now, after Roosevelt steps down from the police force in 1897, the following year, he famously goes to war when America fights with Cuban rebels against their Spanish colonizers. Roosevelt's cavalry regiment was nicknamed the Rough Riders, and he received 23,000 applications for just 1,000 spots in the Rough Riders unit. Just like with the police force, Roosevelt took great satisfaction in assembling a heterogeneous group, from Princeton alumni and rugged cowboys to polo players and Cherokee citizens, and yes, Jews as well. During training, the Rough Riders delighted in giving each other ironic nicknames. Roosevelt recalled that, quote, a young Jew who developed into one of the best fighters in the regiment accepted, with entire equanimity, the name of Pork Chop. When the Rough Riders landed on Cuban shores in late June, they were beset with hazards: scorching sun, torrential downpours, punishing marches, muddy terrain, mosquito swarms. Naturally, Roosevelt endured these fraught conditions in a custom uniform that he had ordered for himself from Brooks Brothers. The Rough Riders' ultimate goal was the seizing of a key city, Santiago. But the Rough Riders, along with other American soldiers, would first have to fight their way through the San Juan Heights, a series of hills manned by Spanish infantry. On the morning of July 1st, the Americans began their offensive. TR was fearless in the face of death. One of his men remarked, he's a perfect devil in action. He's always ahead, waving on the men with his sword in one hand and a big revolver on the other, and yelling all the while like a garret full of cats let loose. A young Jewish Rough Rider named Sam Greenwald sent a letter home to the front, from the front back to his father. And he writes, we have been since the first fighting our way into Santiago, and some of it was pretty hot fighting. I have one more thing to tell you, which I know will please you. I have been made a lieutenant, and the beauty of it, I won it on the field. Roosevelt himself had personally recommended Greenwald for that promotion on account of his, quote, conspicuous bravery. The Jewish press gloried in stories about the heroism of Roosevelt's Jewish troop. These tales of Jewish gallantry challenged stereotypes that Jewish men were weak in body and disloyal to the nation. TR was a collector of stories, and his haul from these years of the 1890s had been especially abundant when it came to Jewry. There was the tale of Otto Raphael, the Jewish immigrant who braved a burning building and earned not just a police badge, but TR's friendship. There was the episode of Hermann Alvart, the German hate monger whom Roosevelt cleverly guarded with Jewish policemen. There was the legend of Sam Greenwald, the Jewish soldier whose courage facing down Spanish bullets alongside Colonel Roosevelt won him a promotion. These stories mattered to TR and to American Jewry alike because they advanced an aspirational vision of national life where Jew and Gentile would stand as equals. In this respect, Roosevelt cut a very different figure than some other members of the Protestant elite who were brazen in their anti-Semitism. Old money gentry were generally fearful of becoming displaced by the new money crowd born of industrial capitalism. Assimilated Jews who had successfully ridden the wave of a modern economy seemed to exemplify this threat. Anxieties about a Jewish takeover were, of course, wildly overblown. The silk stocking Anglo-Saxons still enjoyed outsized control of American society. The scholar Henry Adams epitomized this kind of elite paranoia about Jewish domination. He was the scion of the Adams presidential dynasty, and despite his immensely privileged life, Adams constantly felt threatened by the ascent of Jews in America. He lamented to a British politician, quote, "We are in the hands of the Jews. They can do what they please with our values." He similarly told a senator's wife, "In a society of Jews and brokers, a world made up of maniacs wild for gold, I have no place." And in his autobiography, he shuddered at, quote, "The Polish Jew fresh from Warsaw or Krakow, a furt of Jacob or Isaac, still reeking of the ghetto, snarling a weird Yiddish to the officers of the customs." Now, not everybody in the elite classes took Henry Adams seriously. John Hay, who at the time was an American diplomat and would later become Roosevelt's Secretary of State, said to a friend, paraphrasing Adams's absurd worldview, that in Adams's mind, quote, "The Jews are all the press, all the cabinets, all the gods, and all weather. I was amazed to see so sensible a man, so wild." Hay joked to a senator's wife that Adams was liable to blame Jews for the eruption of Italy's most notorious volcano. As Hay, mock paraphrasing Adams, said, "When he saw Vesuvius reddening the midnight air, he searched the horizon to find a Jew stoking the fire." Now, thanks to the likes of Adams, well-heeled Jews were often blackballed from elite institutions, private schools, social clubs, summer resorts. Roosevelt befriended Henry Adams and his ilk, but TR himself was not complicit in excluding Jews. In fact, as a 20-something, just beginning his involvement in New York politics, Roosevelt threatened to terminate his membership in a Republican club after some participants sought to refuse a Jewish applicant on purely religious grounds. And because of TR's defiant stand against anti-Semitism, that Jewish applicant was admitted. When Roosevelt ascended to the presidency in 1901, this question of Jewish belonging at home would become eclipsed by the question of Jewish survival abroad. Roosevelt did not yet know, as he inherited the mantle of presidential power, that the momentous years now facing him would coincide with the greatest crisis for global Jewry of his lifetime. The Jewish people prayed that this youthful new president, this teller of Jewish tales, might prevent the next chapter in the Jewish story from being written in blood. Roosevelt's tenure in the White House coincided with an appalling wave of mob violence against Russia's Jews, known as pogroms, a Russian term meaning devastation. For 3 horrifying years, marauding gangs of ordinary Russians routinely slaughtered their Jewish neighbors. Sometimes Russian authorities passively watched the butchery. Other times, they actively encouraged it. Never before in the dark history of that empire had Jewish blood flowed so freely. And this at a time when Russia was home to half the world's population of Jews. Most Russian Jews lacked the means to flee the corpse-strewn rubble of their communities, and they lived under the omnipresent threat of the next massacre. These catastrophic circumstances prompted Roosevelt to engage in an ongoing calculus about how to staunch the Jewish bloodbath. As Roosevelt considered his options, several factors weighed in favor of a diplomatic intervention on behalf of Russian Jewry. TR harbored a long-standing affinity for the Jewish people and genuinely abhorred the atrocities visited upon them. He was also drawn to the idea of America as a moral lodestar in the world. Many of his constituents felt the same way. They were aghast at the gruesome details of Russian Jewish life. When word of the pogroms reached American shores, mass protests of Jews and Gentiles alike pleaded for their president to intercede. They imagined that if Roosevelt forcefully spoke out, his words would affirm America's high-minded ideals and shame Russia into reversing its repression. However, any American remonstrance of Russia would carry substantial risks. There was a principle in international affairs at the time of non interference between nations when it came to their own internal matters, even on humanitarian grounds. And if Roosevelt did try to diplomatically intervene on behalf of Russian Jewry, there was no telling how Russia might react. Russia might retaliate by closing prized ports to US trade, or even worse, severing diplomatic ties entirely. Complicating matters further was America's own scourge of mob violence directed at a marginalized minority. If Roosevelt admonished Russia over its Jewish carnage, he risked provoking an embarrassing censure from Russia about the ruthless lynching of blacks in the United States. TR also fretted that issuing public denunciations of pogroms might actually exacerbate problems for Russian Jews. He feared that Russian Gentiles who resented America's bid to shame them might reassert their pride by further lashing out at their Jewish neighbors. And those fears were not without some basis. Roosevelt would have been unsurprised to learn that Russian authorities were stoking anti Semitic fervor among their troops by falsely alleging that Roosevelt was conspiring with Russian Jewish revolutionaries and the King of England to depose the Tsar. Perhaps most significantly, no other head of state in the world had dared to confront Russia over the pogroms. TR would be going it alone. Amid these competing exigencies, Roosevelt pursued an ever-changing foreign policy with Russia. At times, TR defied both the Tsar and international custom by emphatically championing the cause of Russia's Jews. He insisted that the United States had a manifest duty to condemn the brutality that pogromists inflicted on Jewish victims. Grateful Jews in America celebrated Roosevelt for his rhetorical defense of their co-religionists abroad. Roosevelt's approach here should suggest a reappraisal of his famous maxim, speak softly and carry a big stick, by which he meant backstop diplomacy with armed force. Now, that aphorism did fairly describe Roosevelt's disposition towards Latin America, but in his willingness to challenge Russia absent any military threat, we see here a striking illustration of just the reverse. Roosevelt spoke loudly, with no stick at all. In other instances, however, Roosevelt opted for a strategic silence. Conditions periodically required him to promote Russian Jewish interests covertly and thereby forego popular credit. Sometimes he deemed it prudent to abstain from even private entreaties to Russia, especially when Russian society at large began to spiral into a violent abyss. Despite Roosevelt's compassion for oppressed Jews, he harbored significant doubts about America's ability to police the world. His calculated reserve at such times frustrated his Jewish supporters at home. But it should also serve to complicate accusations of cowboy diplomacy that his critics leveled against him in his day and thereafter. TR has often been derided for applying a Wild West approach to global affairs and violently thrashing about the world stage. To be sure, he did oversee an aggressive expansion of American influence in the Western Hemisphere, but declassified records from Roosevelt's Jewish diplomacy reveal his studied sensitivity to shifting context. We find in that version of TR not so much cowboy bravado as careful calibration. Pogroms didn't merely raise a question of foreign policy, but also of immigration policy, as Jewish survivors of persecution crowded the docks at American ports. From colonial times until the eve of Roosevelt's presidency, a period stretching a quarter millennium, the United States had amassed a population of 1 million Jewish souls. It took merely the 7.5 years of Roosevelt's presidency to nearly double that figure. This unprecedented influx of Jewish refugees raised difficult questions for the nation, both practical and moral. Indigent Jews overwhelmed city slums and saturated the labor market. Whether to receive these desperate souls in unlimited numbers was a vexing question. As with his Jewish diplomacy, rival imperatives over immigration led to two Roosevelts, one who inspired his Jewish constituents and another who disappointed them. The Roosevelt who earned their affection spoke movingly of Jewish immigrant contributions to American life. His administration celebrated the idea of the United States as an asylum for the world's downtrodden. He was acutely aware that turning back Jewish arrivals often meant consigning them to a grim fate in their land of origin. And so Roosevelt chastised the Ellis Island commissioner over his questionable treatment of Jews. TR's affection for Jewish immigrants was most manifest when he embarked on a dramatic visit to that symbolic speck of land in New York Harbor, Ellis Island. He, in Rooseveltian fashion, the whole affair was a string of sensational moments. He departed his summer home in Oyster Bay on Long Island on a government-owned yacht, and that yacht forged its way through a tempest that roiled the Long Island Sound with ferocious winds and frightful waves. Back on Ellis Island, officials were skeptical that TR would have actually hazarded the trip amid these cyclonic conditions. But around 2 o'clock that afternoon, amid the fog and rain, the president's yacht improbably came into view. He anchored some distance off Ellis Island, and a tugboat, which was due to deliver Roosevelt the final leg of the trip, defied the howling gale and attempted the ticklish job of aligning itself next to the president's yacht. He successfully embarked on the tug and braved the last stretch of his journey on the deck despite the relentless rainfall. TR cheerfully waved his signature slouch hat as the tug neared Ellis Island's wharf. Once safely docked, a thoroughly soaked Roosevelt raced across a wobbly plank onto that iconic speck of land where each day thousands of aspiring Americans first set foot. His first order of business was to declare that he was appointing a special committee with Jewish representation to uncover any discrimination on Ellis Island. The remainder of TR's tour of the island, which spanned nearly 5 hours, involved various gestures of courtesy to the foreign newcomers. He shook hands and exchanged words with those waiting to be processed. And in one remarkable instance, the president took it upon himself to personally adjudicate a detention case. He summarily decided to free a woman who pleaded with the president for her release. Even more striking than Roosevelt's visit to Ellis Island was an extraordinary announcement Roosevelt made in his second term. He was entrusting the oversight of immigration law to a foreign-born Jew, an audacious move in an era when many old stock Americans were in thrall to xenophobia. Now, the two men were distinct by many measures. Roosevelt had a commanding presence. His appointee to oversee immigration law was actually a cabinet level position, the first Jew in a presidential cabinet named Oscar Strauss. He was, by contrast, mild-mannered. Roosevelt could enthrall a crowd. Oscar Strauss was better suited to backroom diplomacy. Roosevelt epitomized charisma. Strauss decidedly did not. But Strauss had a brilliant mind, an inexhaustive work ethic, and a deep sense of integrity that Roosevelt admired. By assuming charge of immigration, he also became the cabinet secretary for commerce. It's extraordinary. If you go back to the 1860s, Strauss had been an undergraduate at Columbia, where he had been denied membership in a campus literary society on account of his Jewish identity. Now he was conferred membership in the cabinet of an American president. It might be hard today to imagine Columbia having issues with anti-Semitism, but try as you might to put yourself in a historical mindset. So for all of TR's sympathy for Jewish immigrants, TR aggrieved his Jewish friends by backing a congressional bill that threatened to close the gates to the most marginal Jewish immigrants. The bill sought to make literacy in any language a prerequisite for admission into the country. Although facially neutral, the bill would disproportionately reject Eastern European Jews and Southern Italians, whose literacy rates were much lower than newcomers from the likes of England or Denmark. You know, immigrants from England had 95% literacy rates at the time. Roosevelt's intentions were not sinister in endorsing the bill. He worried that immigrants who had settled stateside already would struggle to overcome poverty if their wages and living conditions were perpetually suppressed by an unrestricted deluge of foreign labor. TR saw a literacy test as a means to check industries that were exploiting mass migration. But Roosevelt's benevolent intentions aside, his position on the literacy bill alienated his Jewish allies. They rightly fretted that a literacy test would pose an existential threat to countless Jews seeking to escape habitual bouts of butchery overseas. And TR's support for the bill placed him on the same side as prominent xenophobes who wanted to curb Jewish immigration for fear it was corrupting the nation's racial purity. The bill ultimately failed to pass Congress, but no thanks to Roosevelt. The complicated story of Teddy Roosevelt and the Jewish people took place amid a crucial moment, not just for Jews, but for America itself. Roosevelt ascended to the White House in the throes of a great national transformation. Once a fragile new republic committed to neutrality abroad, America was becoming a global player that projected its power well beyond its shores. Once a young country where Anglo-Saxons predominated, America increasingly saw its streets packed with strange newcomers speaking in alien tongues. In short, America was coming to the world, and the world was coming to America. But the path to globalization wasn't smoothly paved. TR found himself navigating foreign resistance to American intervention and domestic resistance to immigration. The Jewish challenges facing Roosevelt, from massacres to migration, assumed outsized importance in American political life because they threw into vivid relief just how rapidly the country had grown daring in its external engagement and diverse in its internal composition. Roosevelt's mixed approach to Jewish affairs aptly reflected a nation uncertain of its own destiny. Would the United States remain inward looking, wary of fresh arrivals, and obtuse to humanitarian crises abroad? Or would the country embrace the forces of globalization that were collapsing once vast distances between the old world and the new? Roosevelt's checkered answer was of no small moment. At stake for America was nothing less than its very self-conception. At stake for untold Jews was nothing less than their very survival. The night before Roosevelt's funeral, his corpse lay in the trophy room of his Sagamore Hill estate. To reach the trophy room, guests would descend from a raised platform down several steps, where they would find wood paneling and animal skins that lent it the unmistakable air of a hunting lodge. The room was appropriately named. Its many trophies, gifts, and mementos reflected TR's many sides. The buffalo head betokened Roosevelt, the hunter. The Rough Rider saber captured Roosevelt, the soldier. The samurai sword from the Japanese emperor signified Roosevelt, the diplomat. The golden eagle mounted between the windows bespoke Roosevelt, the patriot. A tradition common to Christianity and Judaism alike calls for the living to watch over the dead before burial. And as TR's corpse passed this final night in the trophy room, only one person was permitted to keep vigil over the body. That honor didn't fall to any of the famous personages who had populated his life, nor to the best man at his wedding, nor to his eldest daughter. In these small hours, as the world slept, Roosevelt's sole companion was a Russian Jewish immigrant, Otto Raphael. To be sure, the differences between them were striking. The one, a strictly kosher Russian Jew raised in the East Side slums. The other, a silver spoon cowboy with Dutch blood and a Harvard diploma. But Roosevelt treated Raphael as an equal. It couldn't have been lost on Raphael that back in the Tsar's dominions, he might have been savagely slaughtered, but in the United States, he could keep company with an American president. Theodore Roosevelt was an imperfect leader of an imperfect nation, yet he fervently believed, when many others did not, that the likes of Otto Raphael made America a better place. On that last evening in Sagamore Hill, amid a trophy room adorned with the tokens of feats and fame, there could be no finer symbol of the very best in Roosevelt than this final farewell between two faithful friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Um, that was fascinating. Um, and what a complex and interesting story. Um, and a moment of time and decisions that he was making, which are so resonant, I think, to us a century later. Um, there's a few things it's interesting. I mean, I've heard you speak about this before, but where like what you bring to this coming here, the moment of time you're listening, things always sound different. And I want to start off with that time as police commissioner and his decision to include Jews in the police force and specifically have a Yiddish speaking police force to patrol a Yiddish speaking neighborhood. So it just happens that I was teaching about Philip Roth earlier this week. So I was looking at Newark, which is obviously Roth's hometown, and thinking about Roth in relation to the Newark riots. So for those who don't know, in 67, there were 5 days of mass rioting in Newark because the neighborhood that had been Jewish over the 10 years before had had an influx of Black Americans from the South who were fleeing kind of the Jim Crow laws. They were very, very poor. And the riots were kicked off because although the neighborhood was almost entirely black, the police force was entirely white. And there was huge racial tension between them. So, 60 years on, Newark had not learnt its lesson from Roosevelt. To me, it feels like an incredibly progressive thing to do, not just to police a neighborhood of immigrants with your standard Americans, but actually to turn Americans into the police force. Where do you think that kind of creativity and progressive thought and actually sharp political pragmatism came from?
Yeah, in Roosevelt specifically.
Yeah, and
Um,
Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, yeah.
yeah, it's a good question. I think part of it is he did have, some exposure to Jews. I found when he was in his early 20s, he actually goes to a Purim party with Oscar Wilde, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Um, he has an old college friend who's Jewish. So there's, he grows up in New York at a time when New York is becoming 28% Jewish. And so I think part of it is just an exposure that breeds a kind of familiarity and comfort with Jews. Part of it, I think, is actually rooted in a particular strain of Protestantism called social gospel Protestantism. And his family attends the sermons of a social gospel enthusiast when he's a kid, and he's interested um, in this particular strain of Christianity that emphasizes reaching out to people, operationalizing your faith through deeds, helping those on the margins. And many Jews at that time were very much on the margins, and so in some ways, it's an expression of a particular kind of Christianity for Roosevelt. And then the other thing, which I think you hint at, Aviva, is that Roosevelt he's a political animal. He has very shrewd political instincts, and Jews are becoming an increasingly important voting bloc year on year. And I think Roosevelt understands that paying attention to the Jewish vote is going to matter more and not less with each passing year. And one of the things that's really striking, and I get at that in the book, is that even when he becomes president, Roosevelt keeps this very shrewd eye on Jewish politics back in New York, so much so that when he's president, he catches word that a local slate of municipal judges includes only a secular Jew and not also an Orthodox Jew. And Roosevelt personally intervenes to remedy this omission in this sort of small, trivial judicial election. So it's really a striking testament to how important he saw that vote. And Roosevelt outperformed contemporary Republicans by historic numbers in terms of the actual vote tallies on the Lower East Side. A lot of people have speculated about how Roosevelt performed with the Jewish vote. I actually went through precinct by precinct through the Lower East Side. I'm the first person to actually get hard numbers, and I can actually confirm for the first time that Roosevelt, in a way that was remarkable for Republicans, actually wins the Lower East Side. So yeah, thank you for that question.
No problem at all. There are a couple of questions beginning to come in, but I'm just going to take chair's privilege and kind of expand on that a little bit first. One of the things that really struck me in the book was what happened in terms of his awareness of that vote. So there were kinds of unexpected questions that arose. And of course, one of the questions related to voting is passports and citizenship. And you really do address the passport question in the book, not just in terms of what it means for the Jewish vote in America, but also what it means for both Russian Jews and Americans in terms of kind of being able to visit Russia and all these kinds of questions. Will you just kind of expand on that a little bit for the audience and explain why the passport question is so significant?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I will. I'll say this. You know, that is just one of many topics that doesn't make it into the lecture. Not because they're not rich topics, but I can only cover so much in 45 minutes. And so I encourage those who might be interested to consider getting the book. You know, when it's available in the UK. So the passport question had to do with whether Russian consulates on American soil would visa the passports of American Jewish citizens who wanted to visit Russia. And so, if you were Jewish and you went to a Russian consulate in America, you would be subject to an interrogation on your own domestic soil as to your religious identity. And if you were Jewish, they would refuse to give you a visa to go to Russia. And this was an express violation of a treaty that America had had with Russia going back to 1832, in which both countries agreed that people from the other country would enjoy the full rights and privileges of the native citizens of that country. And now, you know, Jews were fleeing Russia. It's not like there were huge numbers of American Jews who actually wanted to go to Russia. The thinking was not that people were so concerned to get into Russia, but that if Russia was willing to adhere to this treaty and give American Jews the full rights of Russian Gentiles who visited Russia, then you would functionally have two classes of Jews in Russia. The first, foreign born Jews from, you know, not just from America, it could be from other countries too, from Britain. And and they enjoy the full rights and liberties of Russian citizens. And then you have a second tier of domestic Jews subsisting under a discriminatory regime. And the thinking was that that inconsistency would buckle under the weight of its own internal contradictions, and that if you could get American Jews into Russia on equal standing with Russian Gentiles, it would have a domino effect, leading to the ultimate legal emancipation of Jews from their second class citizenship in Russia. Now, interestingly, the Russians saw it from exactly the same perspective. And they were blunt that the reason they had to restrict the entry of American Jews was that they saw that doing so was a necessary antecedent to preserving the regime of second class citizenship for their own Jewish subjects to which they were so ardently committed. So both sides were playing for the same stakes. And and so it can look from you know the American electoral point of view that you asked about, it can look like a domestic issue because it's like, you know, we're American citizens and, you know, we should have the right under this treaty to be able to travel to Russia. But what they really cared about was the fate of their co-religionists abroad. And one of the things that really struck me in researching and writing this book was that even though so many American Jews were living in such indigent circumstances, what they really cared about on election day was what were American politicians doing for Jews back in Eastern Europe. And by the way, not just in Russia, although I talked about that a lot today, but also Romania, also places like Morocco. They really cared about the plight of their co-religionists. They weren't very far removed from those experiences. And it is really striking the degree to which Roosevelt intuited that what would really matter to voters who might be working 12-hour days in the tenements and bereft of basic municipal services, that ultimately they were going to vote based on his foreign policy, not based on his domestic policy.
Mm. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and also what he's doing in terms of setting America on the global stage. Just because you mentioned it, my last little one for now, and then I'm going to bring in members of the audience because there's lots of really interesting questions coming into the chat. But you just mentioned Romania, and in the book, there's a very interesting kind of discussion of the Romanian note. Will you tell us a little bit more about that?
For sure. You know, Romania was one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world at that time. Its Jewish population was hanging on by a thin thread, and there was a bid, a movement within the United States among certain Jews, actually prompted by some British Jews. There's a very interesting British angle here, because a number of British Jews thought that their efforts would be better expended pressing their co-religious in America to push Roosevelt instead of pushing their own government, although they did a little bit of both. As with everything in Jewish history, it's complicated on your side of the pond as on mine, and so some Jews go to Roosevelt and they say, the Jews of Morocco are really struggling, or sorry, of Romania. They're not able to work. They're on the brink of starvation, and the U.S. should intercede in some way. They should issue some sort of message to Romania, pass through diplomatic channels. And the challenge here is that this issue is wholly insular to Romania, right? Again, I referenced earlier, I mentioned this diplomatic protocol, that it was considered improper in international affairs to comment on another country's internal dynamics. And so Roosevelt's Jewish advisors, they offer a suggestion. They say, Romanian anti-Semitism prompts Romanian immigration of those Jews to America. And so it's actually an international issue, and that gives you a pretext to intervene. Now, this was purely pretextual, because there were not even 7,000 Romanian Jews coming to America per year. Roosevelt was not actually that alarmed about indigent Romanian Jews flooding American ports, but he seizes on this as a pretext for justifying some sort of remonstrance against Romania's treatment of its Jewish population. And what I find striking about this is, the criticism of much of American foreign policy, some of it valid, it depends on the moment and the place, which is that America has camouflaged its self-interest in the garb of humanitarian concern. Mm-hmm. With the Romanian, the note refers to this letter that is sent to America's ambassador, who conveys its contents, its remonstrance to the Romanian authorities. And what's striking about the Romanian note is that it's an example of just the opposite. America is actually advancing a humanitarian agenda, but it is speciously cloaking that agenda in the garb of self-interest in order to conform with international protocol at the time. And so it's not the sort of thing in our modern logic we often imagine could happen. But here we see America sort of trying to covertly Trojan horse humanitarianism into a nominally self-interested foreign policy agenda.
I have to say, that was, I know it's kind of not part of the main lecture, but that was one of the moments in the book I found the most fascinating, as you've explained it there, that some of what Roosevelt did was seeming to be supporting Jews, but for political pragmatism. But some of what seemed to be political pragmatism was actually very much for humanitarian and empathetic reasons. So it's a really fascinating unpicking that you do there. I'm just going to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. We only have about another 15 minutes or so, so I hope that's okay. Maybe we'll just bring in 3 people. Let's start off. I'm going to go in order, actually, the chat. So let's start off with Professor Joe Goldblatt. I'm going to add him to the screen so he can ask the question himself if you unmute Joe. You put 2 questions in the chat. Should we focus on the first one, and then if you have time, refer to the second one too?
Yes, thank you, Aviva. And thank you, Andrew, for another brilliant lecture tonight. Do you think that Theodore Roosevelt really believed in speak softly and carry a big stick with regards to the Jewish people? Or was it just politically expedient to be a strong man, such as the type we are seeing in the world today?
Yeah, well, first off, it's good to see you. I know we've exchanged emails on scholarly topics previously, and I appreciate you tuning in. And you ask a good question. With Roosevelt, the answer is almost always both and, right? There's an element of him that is genuinely a strong man, right? He is He's all about American intervention in Cuba, actually going down there and fighting himself. He is responsible for America being able to execute on the Panama Canal. He is something of a strong man and is something of an imperialist when it comes to what become American territories that are still in American possession today, like Puerto Rico and Guam, and the Philippines is no longer under American control, but he is supportive of that kind of agenda. At the same time, Roosevelt has a genuinely humanitarian instinct when it comes to the plight of Jews who are suffering overseas. And one of the things that struck me in this book is that there are moments where Roosevelt is engaging in foreign policy in ways that seem designed to it's sort of a kind of electioneering where he's engaging in foreign policy so that he can talk it up to constituents. But there are other moments where he is spending political capital to covertly advance the cause of immiserated Jews overseas, without any intent or attempt to later garner public credit. And I think what we have to grapple with when we're grappling with Roosevelt is that this is the guy who's both he's the boxing ring brawler and he's the wordsmithing scholar. He's the ultimate Harvard educated patrician and he's the cowboy. He's the bloodthirsty colonel and he's the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And those kinds of contradictions, those kinds of paradoxes are at play in his foreign policy. And they're at play in his relationship with the Jewish community. And so I'm glad you asked that question because it gives me a chance to throw into vivid relief that if you're telling a facile, simple story about Roosevelt, you're probably missing a lot of the evidence in the historical record. So I really appreciate you tuning in and appreciate your question.
Thank you. Aviva, could I just quickly share something very quickly?
Sure.
As you know, I visit dozens and dozens of primary schools with my Joe's boxes, Jewish Objects for Education in Scotland. This week, we're in Orkney, the Orkney Islands, and a Christian gave me a menorah from Jerusalem. And the menorah from Jerusalem belonged to his parents. They were moving house, and he gifted it to me to use in my presentations in the classroom. And I told him how the Jews have particularly suffered the last 2 years, and it's rare for someone to be kind to us. And that kindness, of course, moved me to tears. And it reminded me, Andrew, thanks to you, you're helping us find Roosevelts in every generation.
Oh,
well, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. What a lovely anecdote and a lovely connection. I'm going to take you off screen now, but I just wanted to add, Joe put another really interesting question into the chat. I'm holding on it for now because I want to come back to it when I ask Andrew right at the end to talk about the research that's coming, because I happen to know what his next book is going to be on, and I think there is a link there. So I promise you we will address that, but just give us a few minutes first. And thank you again. Okay, let's bring Bob Olesh in because talking about Andrew's other books, his question actually makes use of research I think that you did for your Hamilton book, or it links to that period. Bob.
Yeah. Thank you for the great lecture. By the way, I used to live in Prescott, Arizona, and there's a statue of Teddy Roosevelt in the court square there as a Rough Rider. But my question is, did Teddy Roosevelt realize that many of the founding documents for America were based on Jewish morals and ethics? I know Washington talked to the Newport Synagogue and realized that also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Roosevelt is interested in the place of Jews in the American founding, and he does talk quite a bit about the way that there were Jews who fought for America against the British, who shed blood and spilled treasure in support of the American cause of independence. And he is also alive to the ways in which Jews were actually really instrumental in helping burnishing the financial resources in the otherwise empty treasury of the infant republic. What Alexander Hamilton understood was that for America to ultimately beat the British, they were going to have to bolster their own credit, and that it was going to be through banking as much as through battles that the Americans would be able to secure their independence. And Roosevelt is alive to that. And so I think to the extent Roosevelt is engaging with the question of Jews in the American founding, he's really looking at Jews who participated. I've not seen direct evidence that Roosevelt was thinking in terms of intellectual lineage, the way that Jewish ideas that what's sometimes called Hebraic republicanism influenced a lot of the founding generation. There's a lot of interesting research that's been done about how ideas taken from the Hebrew Bible actually inform American statecraft in the founding era. I've not seen Roosevelt, letters or writings of his where he talks about that. That doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't in tune to that. It might just be that he didn't put it down on paper, or maybe he talked to Jewish advisors about it and Jewish friends, but it's just not been memorialized or letters have been lost. So I'm always careful to tell my students that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence necessarily. So I've not seen it, but I will say that I think that Roosevelt's interest in highlighting Jewish contributions to the American founding is really important, because there was this idea at the time, and we still see it today in America, that Jews are newcomers, they're outsiders, that they somehow threaten the essential character of the country. And Roosevelt's point is that no, actually, Jewish inclusion is the essential character of the country, dating back all the way to the very origins of the American Republic. So thank you, Bob, very much for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely great question. And I'm just going to add, if you're interested in more about the Washington letter, I mean, Andrew posits something really interesting in his Hamilton's book, which is about Hamilton's influence on that letter, and how that letter was drafted. So maybe at some point, kind of go and have a look either at our recording of his talk on Hamilton or his Hamilton book as well, because there's some really interesting stuff around Jewish influence in the founding documents in that book. So thank you so much, Bob, and thank you, Andrew, for that question. Let me bring Peter Suchet on next. Peter.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, my question that I've uploaded here concerns really his ability maybe to speak the Yiddish language. I mean, clearly down in the south of the island there, the ability for them to speak English fluently would have been challenged. And for communication purposes, I wonder if he was familiar with the Yiddish language, whether he could speak any, understand any, to help him communicate with the people there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have not seen evidence that he could speak Yiddish himself. And I've just assumed that he would have had officers who went with him who translated where necessary. You do see in the settlement houses for these organizations designed to help Jews and other immigrants assimilate would offer English classes. Some of them at any point over a 13-hour period, you could take classes in English, and if you didn't know English, they would give you copies of the Declaration of Independence in Yiddish, actually. Yeah. So, Roosevelt, the Jews that are really in his inner circle are not the Jews that he's sort of helping, whose policies are designed to help. His advisors are of the elite, assimilated, Americanized German Jewish patricians.
Yeah.
Who so that's a different subset. And so that's not to say that he didn't spend time on the East Side, but in terms of the kinds of, but he's often giving speeches to large crowds of people. The people that he's having the one-on-one conversations with, these are going to be assimilated Jews who are fluent in English. So I haven't seen evidence that he knew Yiddish. I wouldn't be surprised if he knew a little bit.
Yep.
He may have known the term, schwitz or something like that. The 10th Street baths where people would wash before Shabbos are still open to this day on 10th Street on the Lower East Side. If you ever need to cool down next time you're out there. So So I wouldn't be surprised if he picked up on some of it. There
Yeah.
are some examples in American history of politicians who weren't Jewish picking up quite a bit of Yiddish. So Nancy Pelosi's father, the former House Speaker, he
Oh,
had been a
okay.
member of Congress, and well before he ran for office, when he was a boy, he grew up near Baltimore's Jewish neighborhood, and he was, what they called a Shabbos goy, and so he would turn lights on and off and stoves on and off in Jewish homes, and he learned so much Yiddish that he was actually able to speak in Yiddish when he was on the campaign trail,
Extraordinary.
courting Jewish
Yeah.
votes. And so there's some examples of that, but I haven't seen anything from Roosevelt like that. But thank you so much, Peter, for that
No,
question.
thank you, Andrew, for the answer.
Peter,
And
I
it was
just want to
very, very good
mention,
lecture. Thank you.
Peter, I just want to mention that the famous actor James Cagney was born and raised in New York, in Manhattan, and he was he's not Jewish, but he was a fluent Yiddish speaker.
Really?
Yes.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you know-
Yankee Doodle Dandy. And he was a
Yeah.
fluent Yiddish speaker because he
Yeah.
had so many Jewish friends.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Bob. That's
Well,
really
I have
interesting.
to tell you, I'm going to do a slight JR plug, but I'm plugging something that is so early in the planning. I hadn't been planning to talk about this for about another 6 months. Um, a year or two ago, we had Naomi Seidman speak for us. She was looking at Freud, specifically in the Yiddish press, what the Yiddish press said about Freud, and showing how actually Freud engaged much more with the Yiddish and Jewish community than we thought.
Yeah.
Following that, I talked a little bit to her and also to Vivi Lax, who's been working on the Yiddish press in England. And we're hoping, I mean, this is in early stages, but we're hoping in about a year or so, we're going to do a big conference about the Yiddish press and some of the figures and political opinions you wouldn't necessarily have thought. And it's making me think, wouldn't it be interesting to look,
Oh,
do that, at
I
what the
would
Yiddish press says about Roosevelt?
really look forward to watching.
Yeah.
I
So
really would. Yeah.
so I'll talk a little bit more to Andrew about it, but
Yeah.
just to let you know, it's probably going to be 2027, but we
Yeah.
are hoping that there's going to be maybe a conference and some
Well,
events
I have a
around
family
that.
connection because my brother, David Suchet,
Of course.
portrayed Freud on the BBC, as you may remember, and it was a fantastic series. So,
So funnily enough, the reason that I thought I'll say it now was because it
yeah.
suddenly
Yeah.
clicked with me.
Thank you for the opportunity
So,
to plug it. Yeah.
And
so
to
we'll
that I say a
maybe we'll
big
talk to
gesund.
you when we do that. I'm gonna just thank you both and pause you there because I do want to bring in one more person and then we'll tie up because we've just got 2 or 3 minutes. But thank you so much, both Peter and Bob, for your questions.
Thank you, Bob.
Let me just ask Joe, because let me remove these spotlights and I'm going to bring Joe on. So Joe has a question. I'm going to ask her to read it, but I might also contextualize it slightly when she asks her question before Andrew continues.
Well, sort of talking of Freud, it's a useful segue actually, because I was wondering, although Aviva alluded to it, whether there was anything specifically in TR's childhood, his upbringing, that either made it really surprising that he would ally himself and identify with Jews, or whether actually it's understandable. There was something in his childhood that would have drawn him towards the Jewish identity.
I'm just going to add
No,
something to that
yeah,
before
go
you
ahead.
continue, Andrew, which is we've been talking the whole time about his pro-Semitic approach, and kind of Joe's question is interesting in terms of that. But your book complexifies that slightly and points out that in some of his private letters, he uses terms like sheeny, which are quite negative slurs. So will you look at both the pro and anti-Semitic kind of roots from the childhood experience?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you for that question. I was just watching Sir Anthony Hopkins playing Freud. And so Freud's been on my mind the last couple of days
Shame
after
on
seeing
you.
that film. Yeah. I think, yeah, so I'll just elaborate briefly on Aviva's point and then come back to your question, Joe, which I appreciate because it's an important one. And I'm the child of a child psychologist. And so it would behoove me to be thinking a lot about people's childhoods. And it's biographers often will breeze over childhood, but it's hard to understand the latter 70 or 80 years of someone's life if you don't understand the first 5 or 10 years. And so I think that stuff is really important. Roosevelt does have this checkered story about Jews, not just in the policy as I talked about, but also, and I get into this in the book, as Aviva indicated, sometimes Roosevelt will say things that are quite philo-Semitic, and sometimes he'll indulge in anti-Semitic tropes. Sometimes he has machinations that there are cabals of Jews who are running global events. And if there's a Jew that he sees as attacking him in some way, he will, let slip some anti-Semitism. So there's a British Jewish journalist named Maurice Lowe, who, after Roosevelt said he was going to step down from the presidency and not run for re-election, Maurice Lowe suggested that Roosevelt was being disingenuous, and Roosevelt describes him as a circumcised skunk, to give one example. And another, he refers to a Jewish politician that he thinks is trying to railroad him early in his career as a sheenie, as Aviva mentioned. And the term sheenie was so offensive by the standards of its own day that when the politician he sent that letter to released a published edition of his correspondence with Roosevelt, they bowdlerized that letter and changed the word sheenie to person so that people wouldn't know that Roosevelt had used it. So it wasn't just sort of offensive by our own time. And so we see elements of both of this. And to your point, Joe, Roosevelt comes from this world of elite patrician New York society, right? His family's incredibly wealthy. When they go on vacation, they don't go for, or holiday, as you say, they don't go for a week, they go for like 15 months. They go all over the world. And so his family is fantastically wealthy on both sides. And so on the one hand, when you're looking at his upbringing, it would be unsurprising in a world where he comes from the elite old stock kind of family, the very people like Henry Adams who felt threatened by the ascendancy of Jews in American society, that he would indulge some of the kind of anti-Semitic tropes that you hear from Henry Adams. In fact, Roosevelt was friends with Henry Adams. By the same token, and I alluded to this earlier, he's growing up in a very multicultural New York with a lot of Jews. He is befriending, Jews in college. Not that there are many Jews at Harvard, but one of his Jewish friends from Harvard actually ends up becoming the coach of the Harvard football team. He, as I mentioned, is part of this social gospel tradition. When he's 15, he tells a preacher, "I want to be a doer." And for him, part of that means reaching out to Jews. And also, interestingly, Roosevelt, when he is an adolescent, visits the Holy Land, and he goes to Jerusalem, and he sees Jews worshiping at the Kotel and crying as they're praying. He goes there on Friday night at sundown. And so Roosevelt knows, when it comes to the Holy Land, Roosevelt knows of what he speaks. And I'll say, Joe, if you'll allow me to use my answer as sort of a launching pad to the next book, my next book will very much be about Roosevelt's post-presidency. And if I'm invited to London, I'm going to come to London and do a talk in person there.
We'll have you back
like
for sure.
I'm getting the wave. I'm coming to London. Stay tuned. It might be in a couple of years. But Roosevelt, he actually knows Arthur Balfour. And when the Balfour Declaration comes out, Roosevelt seizes on it to insist that the Jews be given Palestine as a homeland, including control over Jerusalem. And at a time when, and one of the things I'll draw out in this sequel is that the question of Zionism was very contentious within the Jewish community, but Roosevelt is a kind of arch Zionist. And when the British were actually raising they were trying to recruit people for a troop of soldiers, of Jewish soldiers, an all Jewish regiment made up of Jews, not just from Britain, but from other countries, including the United States and Canada, to reclaim Jerusalem from Ottoman control. And they asked Roosevelt to publicly endorse this effort to recruit American Jews into the British Army for this purpose. And Roosevelt does. He lends his full imprimatur to it. And interestingly, Roosevelt is very adverse to the idea of a Jewish regiment in America because of the Jewish premium on separation of church and state. But in Britain, which has a different relationship between church and state, he took no issue with it and actually supported it. And so the sequel, I'm still writing it, but the sequel it's actually going to begin and end with Roosevelt's relationship with British Jewry, and particularly how it relates to this question of Zionism, including a trip that he takes to London where he meets with the chief rabbi for British Jewry. So there's a lot more to be said on this. There's a lot more to be said on this. In fact, so much more that I need a whole second book. So stay tuned. And thank you, Joe, very much for your question. And thank you to all of you for tuning in, and to Aviva for giving me this opportunity to speak with all of you. I'm really very grateful.
Thank you so much. And I hope Joe can now see why I held his question about Roosevelt's Zionism and what he felt about Jewish land, or Israel as land for Jews, but also land for Arabs. I'm holding that because I think it's not just another book, but there is a whole other discussion. And we're really excited, Andrew, that we're going to keep building this relationship. We'd love to have you back to London to talk about Balfour and Roosevelt. And also, I hope we'll have articles on that book in JR as well in the magazine.
Sign me up.
So we'd love it. Congratulations, Mazel Tov, on publication day.
Thank you. Thank you.
In a moment, I'm going to take off the spotlights and invite everyone to unmute so that they can thank you themselves. But I will, just before I do that, make a little plea, because as you can see, we love supporting all our wonderful speakers, and we do all these fantastic events and make them free to you, our audience. But it really helps us if you do donate a little bit to support us, to make sure we can continue doing this. So if you've enjoyed tonight, please do give JR a little bit of donation and support. And we look forward to seeing you at some of our future talks. But on that note, enough of the thanks to JR. Let's thank Andrew. Please do unmute yourselves, and we'll just have a few moments on gallery view.
Bravo!
Thank him.
Bravo!
Thank you so much.
Bravo!
Really good.
Thank you.
Really excellent.
Really good.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Learned so
Thank
much.
you so
It was
much.
so gripping. It was
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I know there'll be many people also watching this on the video, because about half as many, if not more again, of our sign-ups watch later on. I'm sure everyone really appreciates it. You're a fantastic speaker, and we're so grateful.
brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Have a
you. Thank
wonderful
you so
evening,
much.
everybody.
Take care.